Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast.
Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Katie.
Katie, how are you? Welcome back from Ironman Lake Placid.
Yeah, it is good to be back. It was such an awesome weekend and got to do some amazing spectating, got to run around on the course. And yeah, I never failed to be impressed by how awesome of a day it is at any Ironman, but especially at Lake Placid.
Yeah, Ironman Lake Placid, we call it the Beast of the East. And yeah, I just wanted to start today by saying congratulations to everybody who finished Ironman Lake Placid or really any Ironman this year. And I also wanted to shout out to folks who maybe set out to do an Ironman this year, whether it's Ironman Lake Placid or another Ironman and maybe didn't complete their goal. And so, keep the faith. Ironman is super, super hard. And we'll go through some of those impressions today. And we've talked a lot about why Ironman is super hard. But Katie, I'm really interested to hear your impressions today, being not a racer, but a spectator. It's a really different thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And honestly, I had to convince myself all of Saturday, the day before the race, that I wasn't racing. Just being in that environment, the energy is so electric. And I just kept thinking oh my gosh, is my bike ready? Am I racked? And I was like, no, we're not racing tomorrow. Nothing to worry about. But even being a spectator, there's a lot to keep track of. Coaching on course, it's a really, really big day. So excited to kind of reflect on that. And also, congrats to all of our athletes and reflect on how they all did. So that is our main topic, takeaways from Ironman Lake Placid. But before we get there, I think we'll go through some insights and another update that we haven't done in a little while. But Jim, I'm wondering, how is your injury recovery going? Because we've talked about that a lot on this podcast. And I think you've just about passed this 12-week mark from surgery from your bike crash. So let's start with that today.
Sure. Well, I was hoping, the first goal was that I was hoping that we'd never talk about my bike crash ever again on this podcast. But yeah, so the background of this is I expressed a little bit of frustration the other day on our coach's call. And Katie said, hey, do you want to talk a little bit about that on the podcast? And I started thinking about it at first. I was like, no, I don't want to talk about this bike crash. Nobody wants to hear about this. But then I sort of sat down and wrote down a couple things and just thought maybe these are just some key takeaways that hopefully nobody here has a major injury, but just some preventative stuff and some concepts of expectations. And so anyway, so my expectations were that this is week 12. And I thought, okay, week 12, I'm going to do a victory lap. I'm going to go out and do a century ride. I'm going to feel so much better. It's going to be amazing. It's going to almost like I never got injured before. And my context was I had a very small fracture in my wrist from another bike accident many years ago. And at week 12, I felt great. So that was sort of so I was comparing a hairline fracture to breaking my femur in two places. So first thing was my expectations were not correct in terms of week 12. So anyway, I got to week 11 and just went on a normal bike ride and things just felt terrible. And I've been riding my bike quite a bit, riding it mostly easy. And somehow this last bike ride just really got to me. And then I spent this last week in California. So lots of walking, probably was dehydrated, wasn't doing my strength exercises. Sorry, Neil. And walking on pavement and cement a lot. And just found my hip just really, really, really hurt and things felt stuck in there. So just sort of thinking that progress, like Z2 training is never really linear. There's ups and downs. And I think this was just kind of a big dip for me. And so just sort of I'm recalibrating. It's hard because I was measuring progress based upon days and, every day I'd seen improvement. And then week to week, there was huge improvements. And then to get this setback was a little bit discouraging.
Totally, yeah. And it's super hard because I think when we have these expectations, it can almost feel doubly bad when they're not met, and it's of course reasonable to have expectations. Anytime we go into anything, we're going to have expectations about it. And I wonder, are there any tools that you've used to try to mitigate expectations or just reset when things are really tough? Because for me, I just know that would be really hard. I don't know that I'd really have a set of tools ready to go, but we've also had athletes go through this where their expectations, whether it's in injury recovery or racing or really anything else, don't necessarily come to fruition.
Yeah, I sort of think back to the basics about things okay, what can I possibly do? What am I in control of? And so I realized, out in California, I wasn't hydrating enough. So, okay, great. There's a big one. I know when I'm hydrated, we all feel better. Even if you're not doing a lot of athletics, you just feel better at hydrating. I wasn't doing a lot of mobility. And I could tell things were just kind of stuck in the hip. And so, so think about mobility. Obviously do more strength work, and that's with bands and that's with weights as well. So really coming back this week, back east here, saying, okay, there are things that I can control, the physical things I just mentioned, and also the mental things of saying, okay, right, maybe this is another, 3 months of very targeted rehab. And so reset. And I have been talking about, my goals for next year. 2025 is when I'll be actually doing things. But I sort of in the back of my head have been like, oh yeah, but this fall I'm going to be out hiking and do all kinds of really cool things. And so now just sort of resetting and saying, okay, really, I have been talking about 2025 as really coming back and being fit and doing the things that I love to do. And then just saying, okay, maybe that's really the case. And maybe these secret goals weren't really serving me. So that's a couple of things I've done. And then the other thing I probably should have done in the past was I've always had my hips have always been a little bit rotated and forward, my left hip particularly, and that's the one I fell on. And so I think this is just a key takeaway is that if you do have some fundamental issues that come up, and this could be for injury and or for Ironman. I had athletes who have been chronically injured in the past and then started doing Ironman training. And of course, those chronic injuries are going to pop up again. So again, with Ironman training or just really getting hurt, like if you don't deal with some of the biomechanical issues that you may have, those are always going to come back and haunt you, whether that's an injury or whether it's in training. And so looking back, I should have been a little more proactive about having addressed those issues.
Totally. I think it's really hard when you're feeling great and you are healthy to actually prioritize all that prehab stuff, but doing it beforehand is super, super useful. So things like glute activation before we're running and doing things like the strength exercises that we don't love, the single leg, all of that. But that being said, don't be hard on yourself. This was a freak thing that absolutely sucks. And I really, really applaud your mindset on it. And I think all of our athletes can take away a lot from this, not just for injuries, but even for racing. Maybe you thought that this was going to be your amazing A race year and you get COVID the week before, or you just don't finish. Something goes wrong. It doesn't happen. So these skills, controlling the controllables, are so, so important. And everyone should be thinking about that, whether they're recovering from an injury or they're just approaching their races. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Jim. And we are rooting for a speedy recovery the next couple of weeks, and we will definitely be checking in as you navigate that.
Well, thanks a lot for asking. I appreciate everybody's concern and listeners asking about this as well. But I will assure you that I am staying in the race for President of the United States. I'm not letting this injury deter me. I'm still staying in the race as an independent.
And are you also still angling for the 2025 Olympics, or have we recalibrated on that one as well?
Yeah, I think 2025 is still in play. But stay tuned, listeners. Maybe the next podcast I come back and say, okay, it's 2026. But we're going to start that 100-day meditation. So I'm on track.
Exactly. Well, with that, I think let's transition to a couple more insights. I've got a few this week. So this is our coaching and training insight segment. I was thinking about this a lot last week because we had so many of our athletes tapering for Ironman Lake Placid. And a lot of people struggle with tapering. We haven't really talked about tapering too much on this podcast, but I wanted to reflect a little bit on why tapering often feels so hard. Because, you are thinking, okay, this is going to be great. I've been training so hard. I was so tired during all that. It's going to be amazing once I ease off. But often people actually don't feel that great during the taper. So I've seen this with a lot of my athletes. It's actually very common to feel different types of illness or injury coming on, random niggles that have never, ever bothered you before, kind of popping up during the taper week. And in my experience, often that isn't actually a real injury. Again, if it's really, really hurting and it's multiple days in a row, yes, that's something you want to get checked out. But if you wake up and you're just like, oh my gosh, my foot hurts in a place it's never hurt before, and I've been resting for 2 days, what's going to happen? Know that your mind might be playing some tricks on you, and it's definitely good to keep an eye on it. But just be aware that this is really, really normal. Or feeling like, is my throat sore? Is something going on? Again, if you think you're sick, take a COVID test, but odds are you're just hyper aware of how your body's feeling. And maybe you've had these aches and pains kind of your whole training cycle, but your brain didn't really bring them to the surface. So just be aware that this would be to be expected during the taper. I think the other thing to point out with the taper is if you're really, really reducing your activity levels, which is what we're asking you to do, you are going to have a really noticeable change in the amount of endorphins and dopamine and other happy chemicals that you're used to. And that can kind of mess with your brain. So it's not uncommon to feel like you're a little bit in a funk or more anxious or more on edge just because of that big change. Know that that's also expected. So don't freak out when you feel like your mind's in a different place. It's literally a biochemical reaction to changes in activity levels. You're probably also changing maybe eating habits, sleeping habits. I always suggest that athletes should try to keep these as consistent as possible. Don't change your eating habits radically. Don't change your sleeping habits. But you might not be as tired. If you're used to training for 2.5 hours every day and then it goes down to 30 minutes, that's something to be aware of. And with all of this in mind, I thought it might be helpful to just share a couple of tips for making the taper more bearable. So something I often like to do is I'll allocate time that I would have spent doing workouts to doing other kind of non-training tasks that actually are helping you prep for your race. So pack, organize your gear, write out your race plan, write out your nutrition plan, work on mental prep, all of these things you can do while you're sitting in your Normatec boots or chilling out, but you're not necessarily putting strain on your body, and yet you're still kind of moving towards your race. I also will allocate extra time to self-care during the taper week. So get that massage, do different things that really kind of help you lower stress. I think that's really, really helpful. And then also allocate some time to the people who can lift you up and calm you down. I think, maybe you've been a little bit busy doing your 6-hour rides on the weekends and haven't spent as much time with them, but saying, hey, it's a Tuesday night, I'm going to sit down and watch a movie with my partner. Like, that's awesome. And that's something you might not have done in the past. So all of these things in my experience can help make tapering a little bit easier. But just know, like, all of those bad feelings will probably go away as soon as the race starts. And you're going to be glad that you did it if you actually taper effectively going into your A race.
What I find fascinating about the taper is that it's universal. Almost everybody has some sort of taper blues, or we often say taper rage. We often joke that Ironman should have a hotel for athletes, a pre-race for a week and get away from your family. The opposite of your last tip. But these are all great tips. And I think these are all things that we've seen work successfully for our athletes.
Definitely. So if people have just finished their race, this might not be so relevant to you, but bring this back when you're in your taper and you're like, I am going to do something crazy because I'm so pent up. We always say, actually, if you feel like a caged animal the day or two before your race, you've actually tapered right. So just channel that feeling and use it on your race day. Okay, so next one here, I actually wanted to pull out a couple of insights from a podcast episode that I listened to that, Jim, you recommended last week. So you mentioned that Dr. David Spindler, who is basically a mental performance coach and I think a neuroscientist, he has worked closely with Mark Cavendish and a bunch of other professional athletes, including Chelsea Sodaro. So he works with really high-profile athletes on their mental prep, and he was interviewed on the Rich Roll podcast. So I listened to this episode. This episode changed my life. Honestly, it was such a good one. I really recommend it to anyone, but I'm going to pull out a couple things that really resonated with me in case you just want the spark notes of what this was all about. So first point here that I often will tell athletes before they race is that happiness actually increases time to exhaustion. So you can sustain a higher physical output for a longer period of time if you are happy, and the more happy thoughts that you can create, the better you can perform, which I thought was just a really crazy insight, but it makes sense. If you're in a good headspace, your body is not going to necessarily get the same signals from your mind that, hey, this is really bad, we need to shut things down. And usually, it's your mind that's going to stop you rather than your body. I think a lot of people think it's their body that breaks down, but often it can actually be your mind. So the point here is you need a strategy for staying happy during a race. And on the last podcast, we talked about how Mark Cavendish does this. There's a lot of different methods for doing it. But if you start to feel that negative self-talk coming in, you've got to shut it down. Do whatever you can. Pull out any strategy that you have because it's actually going to change your perception of pain. So that's really cool. I'm going to kind of channel that in future races is how do I stay happy in this experience? Because if you start to tell yourself like the wheels are coming off the bus, this is bad, I hate this, that's not going to be so good for your pain perceptions. I just thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, and I would add here for me also being grateful during a race as well too sort of seems to act as the same thing as happiness, as I just feel like, okay, this takes me out of the physical pain, and I really find that works for me as well too.
So next one here, another insight from this podcast. So Dr. David Spindler was talking a lot about in the 10 days leading up to your A race, you need to do everything you can to eliminate allostatic load. And allostatic load honestly just sounds like his fancy word for LSS. He defines it as this cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events. And his idea is that working with pros, you need to do everything that you can to eliminate those sources. And obviously there's going to be some stressors that you can't eliminate, but a lot of them actually are controllable. So going back to the point on self-care, like do everything you can for self-care, get that massage, allocate time to meditation, allocate time to getting an iced maple latte and sitting in the sun and drinking it, all this fancy stuff. And be really honest with yourself about things in life that are creating stress that you can control. I think sometimes when you're spiraling, it's easy to be like, oh my gosh, all this bad stuff is happening to me and I have absolutely no control. But often you actually do. So think about what you can do, eliminate that in those golden 10 days. And hopefully you have more time to do those things because you're tapering. Last thing too I'll add here is in general for reducing LSS, breathwork can help a lot. So things like box breathing, there's lots of techniques out there. You can try out the Headspace app, meditation, all of that can help you reduce allostatic load in the days leading up to your A race. All right, last one here. So both David Spindler and Rich Roll were talking a lot about this concept of a performance bubble. I also loved this idea, and I think this goes along pretty closely with reducing allostatic stress. So a performance bubble is something they define as the people who are directly responsible for helping you perform. So this can be physically, for example, a physical therapist, be a dietitian, it could be your coach. Mentally, so that could be a regular therapist, that could be your family, your friends, and then emotionally, which goes along with mentally. And the idea here is that these are the people you should be interacting with in the lead up to your event. And it's actually okay to be selfish and try to eliminate interaction with people outside of that performance bubble. So to the extent that you can say no to different events or interactions that are going to increase allostatic load, obviously, you probably have to go to work, but if you're having conversations at work, steer them away from topics that stress you out, steer them away from your race, keep it brief, keep it superficial, and just say like, I am only going to give time to the people who are helping me perform, and other people need to stay out of that. I think this is a little bit different maybe for pros and amateurs, but everyone can create their own performance bubble of the people that are going to help them out. And just be aware that sometimes even people that you're really close with can increase stress in your life. So figuring out how to manage that, I think, is really, really powerful. And planning that out in advance is helpful just as part of your race plan, who you want on race day and how they're going to support you.
Thanks for listening to this episode, because I actually went back and listened to it again yesterday, and I wanted to take notes, but then I saw your notes. So thank you. This is great. It really captures what they talked about and some great takeaways. And the other thing I loved about this episode was that David Spindler was very open about his own mental health struggles, and he said he was in a very bad way. I think he was actually institutionalized even for like a year for about 15, 20 years. So this is a guy who's really battled himself. And so when he brings his expertise to his athletes and his clients, he has lived this. And so I thought that just brought more sort of gravity to his comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not that helpful when someone's going to pontificate about things that they're like, I've never ever struggled with anything, but here's all my tips. So shout out to him for being really open about that. And I think everyone should go listen to it and follow the content that he has out there, because it's really powerful for kind of all athletes and people. All right, next insight here. This was actually a discussion we had on our last iteration of the Endurance Drive Live, but probably relevant even maybe for some of our Placid folks who just finished their A races. But how soon should you wait after an A race to sign up for 2025 races? Because you will see that Ironman will email you 1 to 2 days after you finish your race and be like, the next race is going to sell out. Sign up right now for a discount. Just know that it's not actually going to sell out in 2 days. You do have a little bit of time. And so what I usually tell my athletes is wait at least 2 weeks before signing up for the next race, because you want to feel what life is like in the post-Ironman era. Once some of the soreness has worn off, once you've had time to kind of just, hey, go for a bike ride for fun or spend time with your family, do you really have that drive to say, yeah, I'm super excited to do 6-hour rides on the weekends, week after week after week again? And I think also during those 2 weeks, wake up every day and ask yourself, is signing up for another Ironman a hell yes? And if it's a hell yes every single day for 2 weeks, I think that that's probably pretty meaningful. But you might find that the day after the race, you're like, oh my God, that was so awesome. This is definitely a hell yes. Let's sign up for 6 more Ironmans. But that might wear off just a little bit. And then a second point here is definitely include your primary support peeps in that conversation. So the people inside of the performance bubble, they should all be saying hell yes, because they might not be thrilled if like they spectated all day, it was a hard day, it was a long day, and then the next day you're like, let's do it again, without actually asking them. So it's important to just loop them into that conversation as you figure out if this makes sense for you in the next year, for your family, for your life events and everything that's coming up.
Yeah, this is great advice, Katie. And I love the primary sport thing because I think for you as an athlete, of course you want to go out and ride your bike for another 5 or 6 hours. Like, who doesn't want to go ride their bike? That's awesome, right? Maybe not go swim 4,000 yards, but that's another issue. But I love how you looped in here the primary support. And the other thing I wanted to just emphasize here was, talking to your coach as well too, because we get a lot of people who sign up for Ironman races and then come to us to get coached. And what we often find, sometimes we find, is that maybe their skill level or their athletic development isn't commensurate with an Ironman type race. And so those folks would be better served, doing some shorter races. Or, even if you've done an Ironman and it was a real struggle, we may have a conversation and say, hey, maybe going back and working on some of the more fundamental skills in sprints, in Olympics, in half Ironmans, and then maybe coming back to Ironman, in a few years when you've built up some more durability and skill level to come back and really race an Ironman. So loop your coach in as well.
And I think people often have the perception that Ironman is the end all be all. That is the ultimate goal of triathlon. Honestly, it's not. It's really awesome to train to do a super, super fast Olympic or a super fast half. And the training is going to be different. You're going to get to work on different skills. So I honestly get really excited when I have a former Ironman athlete who comes back to half and I'm like, yeah, we're going to do VO2 intervals on the bike. And we might not have been doing that for Ironman prep, but I think people often find it really fun. So just, have that conversation with us as your coach and we can give you a taste of what's coming if you're willing to sign up for something fun Ironman. Of course, we also love Ironman. We coach lots of Ironman people. but it's just not right for everyone. And I will also direct people to our So You Want to Do an Ironman episode if you're kind of toying with the idea, as well as our Ironman Lake Placid deep dive from a few weeks ago. Both of those can give you a little bit more of a picture of what's coming if you want to do the full. All right, so very last insight here before we get to our main content. This is also very relevant to people who just finished up their A race, but just want to share some thoughts on post-race blues. So there's taper blues, but post-race blues I find can even be a little bit lower and a little bit different. It's very, very common to feel a bit of an emotional low after a big event, even if it goes perfectly. You can have the race of your life, and then the next day or the day after, you might be like, wow, I'm kind of sad. I'm kind of low right now. And I think it makes sense. You've honestly put so much energy into preparing for this one moment. And often an Ironman can really become a big part of our identities. Like we can think, hey, this is what I am. I'm training for this. This is structuring my life and my relationships and all this stuff. It becomes such a core part of who we are that it can often feel like there's a hole when it's over. You're like a little bit lost and trying to figure out what to do. So just know that this is all okay. It's going to pass a little bit with some distance for the race. I find in general, whether it's for post-race blues or anything else, journaling can be really, really helpful. And also trying to find joy in other things that you can do now that your race is over. So emerge from that monk lifestyle. It's okay to stay up late sometimes and spend time with friends and have a drink or whatever that is. Don't go too crazy. But in general, you've had a big thing happen and it's normal that you'll feel a little bit sad. Just know also that your body will adjust to this new normal. And if you're feeling this way, you're definitely not alone.
These are great. And I also find that, just socially, I think you mentioned it, Katie, is that you start to identify as being, I am an Ironman athlete. And then people around you socially, begin to associate that with your identity. And people don't mean to be mean, but they'll often say, after a big event or find out you're an Ironman athlete, they'll say, okay, when's your next race? Or have you done Kona? And they're just making conversation. They're just being nice and polite. But for me, I just always felt like, oh gosh, I guess I better get back on the train here, right? Because that's who I am. And that's just, it's a hard way to go if you are facing, these post-race blues. Like, I feel kind of down. I don't want to do another Ironman. And I think this sort of leads to my next point, which is that, the worst way to combat those race blues is to immediately sign up for a lot of races the next year. And that's something that I did a lot in the past. And I can tell you that it doesn't always lead to a good path and may lead to burnout and maybe not really enjoying the sport. So these are all really good insights. And again, if you are feeling post-race blues, also feel free to loop in your coach as well. We've seen this a lot and can help talk you through that.
All right. So I think with that, we are ready to move into our main content. So we are fresh off the course at Ironman Lake Placid and wanted to share some key takeaways from that whole experience. We've also got some really good feedback so far from our athletes who raced, and I'm going to share a little bit about my perspective as a coach. But the thing I wanted to start with was honestly coming off spectating this race. I had this second wind of being pretty proud of having done this race in the past. And I'm not going to really talk about me in this podcast, but this is such a hard event. And I think watching it as a spectator gave me more appreciation for how hard it actually is. I was waking up early with our athletes. I was up at 3:30 that morning, but then I watched the swim. I actually went home. I took a nap. I had a bagel. I went for a short run. And then I was looking at my watch and I'm like, wow, they're still on the first loop of the bike. Like, they're still going. And then I had lunch and then I walked around and then looking at my watch, like, yep, still just on the second loop. And I'm kind of getting tired throughout the day, just living my life. Finally, I went out to the run course. But all day I was just thinking, like, they're still out there. And when I raced this, I was still out there. It's just such a long day to be pushing hard and exercising and really pushing those limits. So, I mean, I don't know. I could not actually believe that I had done the race before when I was there on course, because it really just did seem like such a monumental thing. And this is not something I would say to an athlete right before their Ironman, but afterwards, I think we can say, wow, this is a huge deal. And finishing this is something, no one can take that away from you. You can have that really forever. I wouldn't wear your medal forever because that's kind of annoying, but it's a really big accomplishment and it's a really hard event.
Yeah, it's so huge. And when people come to me and say, hey, I want to do an Ironman, I'm thinking about doing an Ironman, I'll often say, back in the first Ironman happened and they said, okay, let's do all these 3 sports in one day. But if on that weekend, I think it was in 1978, if they had said, Ironman, the first day we're going to swim 4,000 yards, and then we're going to ride our bikes 112 miles. And then the next day, you're going to come back and you're going to run a marathon. And if that were the case, people would still say, oh my God, you're going off to do an Ironman this weekend? That is like such a massive undertaking. How are you going to run a marathon on Sunday after doing all that stuff on Saturday? It just turns out these guys were crazy enough and they put them all on the same day. So it's just a ridiculously hard and long day. Like you said, Katie, when you can watch the swim and go home and watch 2 full-length movies and still come back and see people finishing the bike, you're like, oh my gosh, this is such a long day.
Yeah, it really is. So just a second way to say congratulations to our athletes. It's a really, really big deal. And it's not a bad thing or it's not an unexpected thing if it wasn't your day. If you didn't finish, this is so hard. So doing any fraction of a day like this is absolutely super hard. I'm going to back up now. So another takeaway from the race, I'm going to take a day before the race. So I went up Friday and I was supporting our athletes on Saturday. And I think I noticed as a spectator on Saturday, but also for our athletes, that it is so easy to get really tired the day before the race. So there's just a lot that you need to get done. You got to go do bike check-in. You're trying to coordinate people. I would say it's a high LSS or allostatic stress day, whether you want it to be a high stress day or not. So a takeaway for me is you need to do everything you can to only complete the tasks that you have to do. Eat and hydrate really, really well. Be efficient with your timing and chill out whenever you can. And this is some advice that you've given me, Jim, but the day before the race, days leading up to the race, if you're standing but you can sit, you should sit. If you're sitting but you can lie down, you should lie down. And if you're lying down but you can sleep, you should sleep. I think that really holds for the day before the race, just because it is such a high stress day, which you don't want to finish that day and be like, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted. And now I'm signing up to sleep for 45 minutes and try to do this race.
Yeah, I love this. I see people, sitting either at the beginning of the start of a race or the day before. And it's always one of those, like, if you know, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you should not be the one who's going to die on the hill of standing up as long as you can, because it's easy to get tired. And I'll actually add to this, some pre-planning for the day before the race is great too, with things like meals, like figuring out what is my dinner going to be. Don't try to say like, I'll hope for the best and get takeout somewhere, because everybody in town is going to be trying to do that. So just plan ahead kind of all your meals, I would say breakfast, lunch, and dinner the day before the race, because you don't want to be scrambling late and getting something that you don't feel comfortable with. It should be all things that are super familiar. So next insight or takeaway from Ironman Lake Placid is the power of the performance bubbles. We were just talking about that group of people that's going to be there to support you. And I would say, to the extent that you can, choose your spectators and the people that you're staying with and that are supporting you wisely, because that can be a source of stress. If you're staying in a house with all of your best friends and there's 20 people that are racing and the music's playing and everybody's moving around, I think that doesn't necessarily lend itself to being super zen. So just think about, like, what does that performance squad look like? It might just be one person. It might be 3 people. But I would say you don't necessarily want it to be like 20, 25 people. Even if those people are all coming to spectate on course, have your own space, have your own room. You want to protect yourself as much as you can with the people that are around you.
Yeah, I think also too, it speaks a little bit like, if you're going to the race with another athlete or a group of athletes, like, choosing who you room with wisely, because, if you're sort of trying to chill out, you're with somebody who's really nervous about the race and talking a lot, or so choose your roommates wisely, even if they're fellow racers.
Yeah, and I would say anxiety in a race setting can be contagious. So you don't necessarily want to be around people who are like, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do? What's going on? If you are racing yourself, just because that might make you second guess your strategy. A lot of people who are making these changes at the last minute, you have your race plan. Like, if you're working with us, you know what you're doing. Nothing needs to change in the days leading up to the race. So kind of tuning everything out, I think, is really, really powerful. Let's get to race morning. So something that I saw happening, not to any of our athletes, but to a couple people who are lining up, is it's really easy to break your goggles or drop your goggles. And so bring an extra pair of goggles on race morning. You don't have to have it with you necessarily while you're lining up, but having your primary support people holding onto those goggles. So if you're in the queue and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where my goggles are, or they just broke, that's not going to be a great situation. So then you might have an extra pair. And it's also good to have both a mirrored pair and a clear pair, because this morning at Placid, it was actually pretty cloudy and it was drizzling, because of course it rains, even if it says it's not going to rain. That's like Placid. But there, I think clear goggles were probably appropriate for this swim. Whereas the next morning, I went for a swim in Mirror Lake and it was really sunny. I was wearing clear goggles and I was totally blinded. And so having those two options, I think, is good. And again, if you break your clear goggles and you wear your mirrored, you're going to be completely fine. But if you don't have goggles, like, that's not a great situation for the swim. Next one here. So we're going to keep talking about the swim. And I'm actually going to pull a couple of quotes from some of our athletes. And I think a big take home from this Ironman, and really any Ironman, is that the swim is probably going to be really chaotic no matter what. So I'm going to read a quote right here from one of our athletes who did crush it. She said, as a swimmer growing up, I thought the swim was going to be the best or easiest part, but it was the most chaotic. I likened it to swimming in a zombie apocalypse. I got kicked in the face at one point and had to do a mental reset to pause, take a breath, and reorient myself and truly just remain calm. I kept telling myself just one stroke at a time and to concentrate on what I could control and not the chaos of my surroundings. And then another one of our athletes said, during the swim, there was a lot of thrashing, kicking, clawing, and elbowing. I know how to swim, but I felt some panic coming on the first time I got kicked in the solar plexus. I did have to look that up, but it's kind of right in the abdomen. At that point, I had to get my mind calm and focus on my swim stroke and try to block out the chaos. So I wanted to say shout out to both of these athletes for really being able to mentally reset, but they described almost the exact same situation. And this was my experience too at Lake Placid. I think any of these 2-loop swims, especially, and swims that have a lot of turns with the buoys, like you're going to end up running over people. People will run over you. There's lots of different paces going on all around you. So just if you tell yourself it's going to be chaotic, that will probably help a little bit. But don't expect like, oh, it's going to be super smooth and chill, because it's probably not. There's just 2,800 people in the water, and there's no way for that to be smooth and chill.
Exactly. Shout out to these two. I've had situations, I think actually Ironman St. George, I had somebody behind me grab my calf twice and pull me down twice in a row. And I just came up and I popped up in the water with my fist up in the air. And it was just this primal response. I didn't get composed, shall we say. I was ready to punch somebody. But yeah, good honor for these guys for resetting in that moment and not panicking.
All right, so onto the bike, couple takeaways from our athletes. Something interesting about Ironman Lake Placid was they added a new loop this year, so they changed the bike course just a little bit. And I have not actually been on this loop before, but apparently it was pretty gnarly, and there was a little bit of a hill that hit a 13% grade, which is crazy for Ironman. There was also a covered bridge, and there were some sharp turns. I actually watched on the live stream that Danielle Lewis, who is the pro who won the race, she hit the corner and flew off her bike and fell into the grass, and she was fine. Luckily, it was a really soft landing, but even really competent bikers were struggling with this new section. So that's something to be aware of. It's really good to do a course preview just to know what's going to happen. I'm going to read a couple more quotes here again from our athletes. One said, on the bike, I had to dig deep on the second loop on the new section. We hit a 13% grade at one point, and he kept repeating the mantra, you don't have to do this, you get to do this, and you will do this, which is a really, really powerful mantra. But that bike is super challenging. And I think I did a little shakeout ride the day before and was just thinking like, wow, these hills are no joke. They are serious, serious climbs in Lake Placid. And another takeaway that's important is if you haven't practiced riding hills on your TT bike, you are going to struggle on this course. And I think that was maybe a contributing factor to people who struggle on the bike, was just not having the time in the saddle on hills. I'm going to read one more quote here from the bike as well, from one of our athletes who said, during the bike, my mind went to some dark places throughout. Trying to shift my mindset, hiding some of my metrics, and taking in nutrition were key. And I really want to highlight this point about hiding some of your metrics, because this is something that I've thought about recently is, if I'm trying really hard to stay in a happy mindset, if I see my power and I don't think my power looks good, I'll often be very critical of myself. And then I realized well, no one at the finish line really cares what your power was. They care what your speed was, and it's important to stay in the right heart rate zones. So why don't you just hide that power? And you can look at it after if you want to, but staring at it and having negative self-talk about it is not that helpful. So I'm just really proud of this athlete for realizing that during it and knowing that you can set up different data screens kind of based on how you're feeling. And if you see good power, it makes you feel good. That's awesome. But if not, that's something to be aware of.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think I've always struggled with that too as well, especially the power part of it. And so that's why I've always done a lot more heart rate on race day, but it's funny, we train so much with power. But I find the same thing, Katie, this negative talk of like, if it's a good power, I'm like, well, it could be better power. And of course, if it's not exactly like, it's in like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing it 220 watts, but I'm at 218. Oh my gosh, where's that 2 watts coming from? And so it just starts this, the story in my head, this negative story in my head. So yeah, I really like the idea of sort of hiding it, or just sort of, you can just get a glance to make sure that you're not overcooking it, for example, maybe starting off, but then just sort of going by heart rate and going by feel. And as we talk about a lot in Ironman, it's really about how aero can you be, whether that's on a TT bike or a road bike. It's just all about reducing frontal drag, which really means that you'll just be going faster. And as you say, at the end of the day, your race results reflect your miles per hour.
Definitely. All right, so let's talk about the run here. Again, these are going to be some takeaways from athletes. One said, during the run, my legs felt like cement, but checking in with myself, I realized I could still move them, even if it felt like running through mud. Just one foot in front of the other, one patch of shade after another, a cup of ice to look forward to. My mind wanted to slow down and walk, or even give up, knowing that it was all optional and all I had to do was stop to make it not hurt anymore. And I think here, something that's really, really meaningful is even if you're walking, you need to keep moving forward. Because if you do stop, that's where your mind says, hey, oh, that feels really good. I like to stop. I don't want to keep going. So not giving yourself that option and just keeping forward, I think is really, really helpful here. And know here, with this athlete, like a lot of it's kind of mind over physiology or how you're feeling physical. It really comes down to just convincing yourself you need to move forward and chunking it up into aid station to aid station or patch of shade to patch of shade, rather than saying, okay, great, I have 24 miles left. I think that's a good mental strategy. But yeah, it can get dark out there and it's a long, long, long run. And I was spectating most of the run. I was out on the course and I was getting tired just standing there or periodically running a little bit with some of our athletes. And then I was like, wow, imagine if I were running this entire time. Like, it's just such a long day.
Yeah, it's such a long day. And I think one of the biggest hurdles to overcome on the run on an Ironman is that, when you do even your race sims or your zone 2 runs, maybe if you're running at, let's say 9-minute pace, for example, and you're out there running your 18-mile, your long run, and you're hitting 9-minute pace, like, this is what I'm going to be doing during the Ironman. And then when you get to the Ironman, if you're doing a 12-minute per mile, you're like, this is really good. It feels slow. So just getting over that, we actually never really train at the run paces that you're actually going to do in Ironman, or very rarely. And so I think it's hard to go from, running all your long runs at a certain pace and then saying, oh gosh, I'm 2, 3, 4 minutes slower during Ironman run.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's not impossible, but it is really, really rare. So just maybe hiding pace, if that's struggling for you, like, let's just look at heart rate and let's just go aid station to aid station, or even just having a stat like total elapsed time on your watch might be more useful than being like, okay, this is my pace and it feels really slow. I'm going to read one more quote here. It says, on the run, that smaller out and back at the top of Lisa G's was where it really became mental. You can hear the announcers and the stadium and the roar of everyone on the hill. And once you crest the top, you make a right and turn away from all of that. It's the feeling of being so close yet so far. In that moment, I just thought of all the love and support I had throughout my months of training and the energy of the spectators in town. I made it my mission to run or shuffle back to that energy, telling myself just one foot in front of the other. And this is really interesting because they also changed the run course. So normally you would turn left at the top of the Lisa G's hill. Now you actually turn right and go for a ways out that way, which used to be part of the bike course. I'm not sure why all these changes happened, but it's tough because yes, you are going away from what sounds really inviting. And that's true, honestly, for a 2-loop course. You pass the turnoff for the finish line and you might be near people who have half a mile left and you have 13 and a half miles left. And that's really, really, really hard. But again, just telling yourself like, hey, one foot in front of the other, I'm going to keep going. And especially with this athlete, thinking about your people, the people in your performance bubble, the people that have supported you, I think that's a really important way to keep things happy and keep your mental game locked in, even if physically you're starting to really, really hurt.
Yeah, I think this year, sort of jumps ahead to our one of our other points here, is that I think this year, Katie, we saw so many of our athletes doing mental prep and how mental prep is key. And it really showed in these comments that we got back from our athletes that they did the mental work before they showed up at the race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we used to say like swim, bike, run, and nutrition are the 4 legs of the triathlon. I think I would add mental prep. I think it's as important as all the other legs. And I don't know that we've ever really emphasized it in the way we have this year. But seeing our athletes just keep moving forward, even though things got hard, I think that was probably almost entirely due to the mental prep. Of course, trying to nail fueling, of course, trying pacing. But this is really the way to unlock, I think, the next level performance in Ironman.
Absolutely.
So next one here, it's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the weather. We always talk about the weather on this podcast. But interestingly, the forecast looked amazing for Ironman Lake Placid this year. There's been a lot of heat waves on the East Coast. And this time it was forecasted as a high of maybe 71, 72 degrees. It was cloudy when the race started. It was cool. The humidity wasn't too high. But as I was out spectating on the run, starting probably around 2 p.m. and I was out there in the same spot on Recycle Lane until maybe 6:30, 70 to 75 degrees and sunny is actually pretty hot. Like, it doesn't sound hot, but it is. And so anytime the sun came out, like, I was sweating a little bit. I was noticing that it's warm. So I think even if you see, a forecast that looks good, obviously this is better than 80 degrees, 85 degrees, 90 degrees, but you still need to cool effectively if it's over probably 65. Anytime the sun's out, it's going to be a little bit warm. So I think in general, I don't know that heat was a huge issue for many of our athletes this year, but it wasn't cold out. And I think for some people, salt and electrolytes, that could still be an issue. You can still be sweating a lot. So anyone who had major issues with cramping, that was probably a salt issue. And a couple of my athletes reported to me that taking in base salt was really helpful if that happened, as well as different types of salt tabs. So just don't think like, oh, it's cold, so this isn't an issue. It's still warm if it's 70 to 75 degrees and sunny.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind here too is that, especially for the run, you've done a big swim and then you just bike 112 miles and your core temperature, regardless of whether it's 70, or of course, if it's going to be 80, 85, your core temperature is going to be up. So when you come off that bike in T2, your core is way, way, way up. And so you're probably already on the edge of like losing your thermal regulation. So just the mere fact of moving for that period of time, your insides are going to be hot.
One thing I will say, though, that surprised me, this was an interesting insight from one of my athletes who told me this as he was on the run. So I was biking next to him and he told me that it happened. But on the bike, it was actually pretty cool to start out. I don't think it had even broken like 60, 62 degrees. And we had nailed down a really solid hydration strategy for him because he'd struggled with some cramping in a marathon previously. And he said actually that he had to back off a little bit on the hydration because he was hydrating so well and he was just like peeing a lot, which is super normal if you're well hydrated. So I would say if it's not hot at all, you're not sweating a ton and you're pounding like one bottle with a ton of sodium per hour, you might actually want to just ease back a little bit on that. It's really hard to tell, and I would say it's better to overhydrate and just pee a lot than to underhydrate. But in general, that 60 degrees and cloudy, that is still pretty cool. And maybe you can be a little bit more strategic with when you're taking in bottles if that's the case.
And the real question here is, did they pee on the bike or did they pee off the bike?
I didn't ask. I didn't want to ask too many questions because he was in the middle of the marathon of his life. But it's a great question. And yeah, later in the day, as I was picking up bikes, I was helping athletes out. I was like, don't touch the saddles. That's the tip. You got to not touch the saddles of these bikes because you really never know. All right. So this one here, this should come as no surprise, but I just want to pound it in. Major insight from Lake Placid is that fueling is the way. So many of our athletes crush their days and were super consistent due to fueling. And I wanted to share an example from one of my athletes, Robin. He had done 2 Ironmans previously. And I hope you won't mind if I'll share his times. We were talking about them. I'm just so proud of him. He'd done 14 and a half hours and 15 and a half hours at Ironman Mont Tremblant and Ironman Florida, respectively. So those are both hard, but not as hard as Ironman Lake Placid. And this year, I think the biggest focus of his training was us figuring out a fueling strategy that was going to work really, really well. And he had the race of his life, 12:45 at Ironman Lake Placid. So taking off almost 2 hours on his Ironman PR, having, a super consistent run. He was running, I think, like mid-9s pace, which was absolutely incredible the entire day. The tracker was like ping, 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 perfectly consistent. I think that was almost entirely due to the combination of fueling and fitness and also some good mental work. So shout out to Robin, and know that this too can be you if you nail your fueling. I feel like all the athletes, as soon as I saw them on the run course, I was asking how fueling went. They all looked great and they said that they fueled well on the bike. So that's really, really important.
Yeah, congratulations to Robin. This is a huge PR. And congratulations to coaching. I think coaching probably had something to do as well with this, Katie.
I'm not going to take the credit. This was really all him and all of the gels and blocks and bars and all that stuff a few times. So really, really awesome to see it. Okay, I think last one for me here, I was a spectator. So I have a few more thoughts on best practices for spectators so you can best show up and support your athletes. Number 1, downtime is key. So I mentioned this before, but after the swim, you're not going to see your athletes for probably 6 hours minimum, depending on how fast they're going to bike. I actually went back to the house and I took a nap because I'd been up at 3:30 and I had some food and I went for a little run. And all those things really helped me be able to show up on the run and be outside on course for 6 hours on the run course and then longer as I was waiting to finish for people. So it's just really, really important to take care of your needs so that you can show up when it matters, which is especially at the finish line. I would say they also don't try to spectate the bike. I mean, it worked pretty well for us. Our Airbnb was close-ish to the course. So at one point we just zipped out to try to catch athletes coming by, but it wasn't the same thing as going into town and waiting, standing on your feet, trying to see people. I think it's awesome if you can make it work. But we've said this before. It's really, really hard to time bike spectating. And if you do it, you're going to see people for all of 3 seconds. So I'm not sure if that's entirely worth it, if it's better to just kind of protect your energy. And then final thing here that was interesting, there was a really awesome pro field for both men and women in this race. And so I was really excited to be like, oh, I want to watch so-and-so. I want to watch all these pros. But seeing pros on the run and seeing your athletes and age groupers can honestly be like a 6 to 8 hour time delta. The winners of this race are crossing the finish line at like 2 p.m. And many people are crossing the finish line at like 10, 11, midnight. And so just keep in mind that if you go out to the run course trying to see pros, you're going to be out there for a really, really long time. And so the way we approached this was, okay, let's see some pros towards the end of their race, so mile 20 or something. And then we can see some of our athletes who might just be starting the run. We were sought there for a really long time, but it did help a little bit, because if we tried to see the pros at mile 2, that would have just been such a long day. And I don't know that I would have been able to show up fully and run around the finish line and scream super loud when all of our athletes were running.
So what you're saying is that an Ironman doesn't look like what NBC shows on their Kona coverage?
It's a little different, I have to say. And a point here is everyone should spectate an Ironman, especially if you want to do one. It's a really cool experience, and it's a really eye-opening experience where spectating it did not make me want to sign up for another one. It made me say like, wow, that's really hard. And I am glad that I've checked this off my list for now. All right. Well, those are our Placid takeaways. I'm sure other ones will come to us kind of as our athletes continue to process their races. But again, huge congratulations. We're just so proud of all the work that went into these performances. And I think with that, we are ready to transition to our last couple of segments. So we're going to start with Challenge of the Week. And mine, I've been working on my sleep hygiene recently. Sleep is so important. Maybe that's the sixth most important. We've got mental work and food and swim, bike, run, but sleep's really, really important. And I think one thing you can do to improve your sleep hygiene is to spend less time on your phone. So 3 tips for doing this. I have a timer on my social media apps, so I don't spend more than 10 minutes a day on all my different social media apps, which is good because I think sometimes we have a tendency to just open up because we're not doing anything. But having the timer just gives me that second thought of like, do I need to do this right now? Am I doing it for a purpose, or am I just bored? So that's a good thing to do. Second one is try putting your phone in a different room before you go to bed. And this I actually experienced in Lake Placid because the house I was staying at, I was in a bunk bed in the top bunk and the outlet didn't reach to my bunk. So I had to plug my phone in far away from me and then just decide to go to bed. And I slept great for 3 nights, except for my 3:30 a.m. wake up. So I think that's probably something to consider if you find that you spend a lot of time on your phone, like bright screens before bedtime. And then finally, if you can do a little bit of a buffer, having like a 30-minute buffer between screen time and bedtime, whether you're going to read or meditate, etc., instead, I think is really helpful. And I'm sharing these tips just because I have tried all of them recently and they have helped me and my sleep has gone up. You can ask my Oura Ring. So I would highly recommend doing what you can to up that sleep hygiene a little bit.
Well, what does your Whoop say?
I don't know if I should say this out loud on the podcast, but I gave my Whoop to Colleen because I got the Oura Ring and I was like, I can't have both of these. So I'll ask her what she thinks of the Whoop experience.
I love this Challenge of the Week. And I think it's just important to remind people that, the modern mind is actually really a primitive mind. And so I think, we even had a hard time when TV came online and advertising came online. I think we just don't have enough of our brain to even process like that level of information. And then, of course, I'm the first person to doom scroll as well, too. So I do it all the time. But I have to remind myself often, I'm like, I'm not equipped as a human to really deal with this level of information.
Totally. Yeah. So we can all kind of work on that together and see what your Whoop or your Oura Ring says about your sleep.
All right. Well, my challenge of the week, and this theme here is to start dreaming about your fall. And here's the key: unstructured adventures. So you've done your race season now. And so now, what do you want to do for fun this fall?
Yeah. It's like, how do you want to take your Ironman fitness for a spin? Basically, it's like exactly. Do a Prezi on a beautiful fall day for no reason. I love that. Okay, let's push the same segment that we tried last week again of our article, podcast, or movie recommendation of the week. And everyone heard me. I was a +1 on the Rich Roll interview with David Spindler, which we're linking in our extended podcast show notes. But then I was really motivated and inspired by this whole Mark Cavendish story. So I watched the Mark Cavendish documentary, Never Enough, which was excellent. And if you're really into the tour or just into stories of kind of resilience and coming back from rock bottom as an athlete, you should watch this documentary. I find it really, really inspiring and motivating, just like I recommend Miracle for Lake Placid. So if you've got a race coming up and you want to watch a motivating movie every night to get ready for it, definitely check out that Mark Cavendish documentary.
Yeah, +1 of that Mark Cavendish documentary. I think even if you're not a cycling fan, I think you're really going to enjoy it. So my recommendations this week are to follow Steve Magnus on Instagram. I know we mentioned Steve a number of times. He also has a podcast that I love, which is called On Coaching with Jonathan Marcus. But Steve's always dropping lots of gems on Instagram. And then my other recommendation is that I was reminded this week when I was charged for my Outside online subscription, and this email came through and said, we just charged you money. And I'm like, I don't want to be charged for money. And I logged back on to Outside. And I'm just reminded there's just lots of great articles on backpacking and hiking and gear and the tour. Anyway, so I thought this is a worthwhile bookmark to have on. And it's just nice also to pay for some content.
Awesome. Yeah. So shout out to Outside. And especially if you're brainstorming your adventures, they talk about really cool adventures that you can do. Let's go check that out. All right, final segment here, gear pick of the week. It is still pretty warm. It's not as warm as it was, but it's still pretty warm and it's important to hydrate. So I am going to recommend Element. It's the letters LMNT. It is a hydration, kind of high sodium, high magnesium, high potassium thing that you put in your water. And you'll find actually, I didn't like Element for a little while because the first time that I tried it, I just tried it when I was not actively sweating and it's super salty. So if you try it without actively sweating, you might be like, this is gross. It tastes like slightly fruity seawater. But if you try Element when you're sweating a lot, it tastes like the best thing in the world because your body is craving salt. So now I basically have Element whenever I'm exercising in the heat. And they have a really cool new product that I tried for the weekend, which is these Element seltzers. So they're these large seltzers that have the same type of electrolyte content, but they're a little bit fizzy. And so those are really, really good. They're a little expensive, so just be aware that it's a special treat. But I've been enjoying Element and definitely recommend it to all of our audience.
Element sent me actually like 12 of the seltzers just out of the blue.
Was it a sponsorship?
I must be sponsored or something, right? Or I was just a fool enough to go on their website and spend a bunch of money on all their boxes. But yeah, it's funny that I had the same exact experience. The first time I used it, I was like, this is terrible. And then I started sweating, like, this is the best. And what I like to do at home now is to take a big hydro flask and take maybe half of an Element and then put a bunch of ice cubes in there. So they have a hydro flask with water and half Element and ice cubes. A really cold Element is just awesome.
That sounds amazing. Yeah. And I will add too on here, you can mix Element with something like Scratch. So my go-to big ride endurance fuel is a mix of Scratch Super Fuel and Element because Scratch often does not have enough electrolytes for me if I'm sweating a lot. So just know that you can mix and match. You can play around with the flavors, like a citrus Element plus the lemon lime Scratch is really pretty good.
That's awesome. I gotta try that. My gear pick of the week is the Bike Hand Heavy Duty Precise Bicycle Head Hex Allen wrench set, which is a fancy way of saying it's a small sort of handheld hex set that they're colored. So I find that really good because a lot of the hexes that I have are just, they're all the same color. And I'm like, which one's the 4? Which one's the 5? Which one's the 6? And these are all nicely colored. And so anyway, I have a set in my garage. And I also, the pro tip is to buy another set and put them in your car as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for listening. We will be back next week. I guess we didn't even celebrate the fact that this is episode 40, which is a huge deal. And we're going to keep it rolling for the next couple of weeks and months. We've got a lot more athletes that are racing. But yeah, we just really appreciate the viewership. And if you have a chance, please send us a rating or review.
Thanks, peeps.